We will next hear from Marc Morano, and Marc Morano is, he works in the Senate. He is a real leader on climate change issues.
To have a global warming solution, which is what I'm going to talk to you today about, the economics and Capitol Hill politics and the, it's going to take a minute here, and what's coming down the road here, possibly in May. But just to follow up on what Marlo said briefly, he's absolutely right, where everyone's focused on cap and trade legislation, but we have several back doors that people can slip stuff in, and one of them is the Supreme Court ruling CO2 is a pollutant. Even if the Bush administration does nothing, future EPAs now potentially have the power to regulate CO2 as a pollutant, and once that happens, you know, the cap and trade could potentially become irrelevant. And also the polar bear, and we talked briefly about this yesterday, 5,000 back in the 50s and 60s to now 25,000. U.S. Geological Survey says they're at historic highs. All the fear is from computer models, yet there's serious consideration going on for Endangered Species Act. Well, if it's listed under the Endangered Species Act, we're literally going to have a situation where someone in Florida running their lawnmower, someone in Texas lighting a fireplace, someone driving their SUV in Oregon could then be cited for violating the Endangered Species Act because you're theoretically affecting the habitat of the polar bear, which I guess their new habitat will be up in the atmosphere. Maybe the first time the Endangered Species Act is going to apply to the atmosphere as a habitat, a little bit different than historically it's done. And so when you look at that, you realize that the promoters of climate fear, the environmentalists who've been hyping this, have been at this a long time, and they've planned this out. This takes years, it takes money, it takes organization, takes planning, and they've got a Supreme Court ruling on their side. They've got an ESA, which, as Marlo said, depending on who you listen to, looks like it might happen. And if that's the case, again, cap and trade is not going to be the only fight in town, and it's going to turn it very difficult. So right now in the United States Senate, the Lieberman-Warner climate bill is coming up. Well, let me see here what we got here. Here we go. At least you got it hooked up. The Lieberman-Warner climate bill is coming up. They're looking at May for this. And this is a bill which even the proponents, the authors admit, will have no detectable impact on the climate. Yet here in Washington, D.C., it's being touted as the greatest thing since sliced bread by the promoters of, the worriers of a climate crisis. And what they've done is they've laid out the scenario now. They're working on getting a lot of GOP senators. They're coming down. It could be a 3-week battle in May. And when this bill comes up, we have a outline here, which I'm going to show you, which is basically lay out how the American people should look at this bill. And let's see if I can, there we go, okay. When I came to work for Senator Inhofe, it was actually quite a lonely place. 2006, we're talking only 2 years ago when you talk about the global warming debate. We had Al Gore's film, was just released. We had Hollywood, multiple specials on TV. You had Time Magazine, all the networks. People were riding high. And I just want to say that 2007 and now 2008 is the year the skeptics, and skeptical scientists and the skeptics are fighting back. We have our report of over 400 scientists. We have our report, we did a polar bear report separately on that with the latest peer-reviewed literature on the Arctic. And what we're finding out here is that with this Heartland event, skeptics are starting to come out of the woodwork, essentially. We're adding sometimes up to 2 to 4 scientists a week. They're getting excited. Okay. Ah, here we go. Colors are off? All right. This is where we started. When we started in 2006, and I tried to come in with the attitude of brass knuckles. We weren't going to take the media anymore. We weren't going to take all these false claims of all scientists agree. So we decided to go after reporters by name, citation. And what we did, first of all, here's what we were facing. Washington Post asserted, only a handful of skeptics left. ABC News, this was one of my favorite quotes. After extensive searches, ABC News has found no such scientific debate on global warming. That's 2006, Bill Blakemore. because I like that picture. This is Al Gore was the king in 2006. We went over this. Michael mentioned this. The quotes here: "People are criminally irresponsible to ignore the urgency of global warming." Heidi Cullen called for decertification. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. said skeptics were treason, traitors. NASA scientist James Hansen called skeptics deceitful. Environmentalist David Suzuki of Canada urged skeptical leaders be thrown into jail because what they're doing is a criminal act. And this was just about 2 weeks ago, well, maybe 3 weeks ago. And the question is, what consensus? And this is something I just was talking with BBC about this. 52 scientists participated in the IPCC summary for policymakers. 52 out of the 2,500 they like to claim, which, by the way, includes Fred Singer, Pat Michaels, John Christie, Roy Spencer, and a whole host of, Ken Green back there waving at me, a whole host of skeptical scientists that they try to claim. Well, only 52 actually sign off on the alarmist summary. Same with all these academies. American Geophysical Union has 50,000 members, but a 9-member panel approved their statement on global warming. Same with the AMS, the National Academy of Sciences. Essentially, all these members don't really know what the statements are and have no direct vote in it, but yet it's touted. That's how they create the consensus. We have over 400 prominent scientists, more than 24 countries, who are dissenting, who are dissidents. I believe Andrew Revkin of the New York Times referred to the scientists here as dissidents, which I think is a good phrase. There's a group called Climate Resistance, which is another interesting phrase, the climate resistance, as we go forward here. So the 400 scientists have now growing. It's almost at 500, about 480 or so. As I mentioned yesterday, Joanna Campbell, first woman PhD meteorologist in America, in the world actually, came out recently and said she was a skeptic and dissented from the view. She had just retired, of course. Same with the top Portuguese scientist, just retired, just came out as a skeptic. A theme there we're finding out because they don't want to be thrown in jail. So how do we get here? This is one of my favorite quotes. This is Newsweek magazine. The longer the planners delay, the more difficult they will find it to cope with climatic change once the results become grim reality. Well, think about that. That's the tipping point. Well, there's one problem. That was April 28, 1975, and Newsweek was referring to a coming ice age. So you see, Al Gore and James Hansen aren't the original innovators of the so-called tipping point. This is the original United Nations graph that shows the medieval warm period as much warmer than today. This was later replaced by man's hockey stick, which then later disappeared from the UN after all the discrediting work on it. But it's interesting to see the UN in 1990 actually started with I think a paleological record that a lot of scientists here would agree with. 4 points, and we try to keep this. I try to keep this, especially for political Washington. We don't want to get into too deep of let me see here. Too deep of scientific debates. What's that? Okay. Yeah. The Earth is well within natural variability, and this is seen in multiple ways. The Arctic has cooled the last 1,500 years. A new study from Sweden just showed that. Greenland's high point in temperatures in the 1940s, or 1941, before 80% of CO2 was in the atmosphere. We're seeing the Antarctica, the southern hemisphere is cooled. We're seeing multiple studies in 2007 saying the medieval warm period was warmer than today. We're seeing studies that say the 20th century weren't anomalously warm. The New York Times, Andrew Revkin has acknowledged that recent temperatures are not outside natural variability. So you start with that premise, and then you get to point 2. All fear is driven by unproven computer models. So make the burden of proof on them. If we're within natural variability, they have to prove there's a climate crisis, and that requires extraordinary proof, or even some proof would be nice. And this whole concept, Andrew Revkin, New York Times, likes to say this: more CO2 equals a warmer world. Well, there's one problem with that. The peer-reviewed literature increasingly shows rising CO2 will not have a catastrophic impact. In fact, many scientists say there's a saturation level. Many scientists think we've already seen most of the warming, or a lot of the warming we'll see, and that future warming, it essentially flattens out. Climate change consensus does not exist, and that's, we showed that. So we actually did a study here. This is looking at U.S. tax increases. If we had passed the Kyoto Protocol, or I'm sorry, Chris Horner will kill me for that. If we had ratified the Kyoto Protocol, we signed the Kyoto Protocol. This is what this is estimated by the Wharton School. These previous little numbers down here are past tax increases. There's a Clinton tax increase in '93. There's a first President Bush in 1990. That's the kind of level of taxation the American people would have faced had Kyoto gone into effect. The motives for Kyoto. Kyoto represents the first component of an authentic global governance. Now, people will say, oh, I hear the black helicopters coming. Inhofe's spokesman. This is a quote. I'm giving you the quote of Jacques Chirac, who said that. Kyoto is about the leveling the economic playing field for big business worldwide. Margot Wallström, formerly of the EU. Richard Lindzen, I think, set up this whole thing perfectly. Controlling carbon is a bureaucrat's dream. If you control carbon, you control life. Read that again. Controlling carbon is a bureaucrat's dream. It is the most profound statement, because that is exactly, essentially, the goal of doing this. So when you control something that we exhale from our own mouth, this is a brand new situation we're about to face. And there's nothing, the environmental movement has been waiting decades for something this all-encompassing, and they're on the brink. Of course, President Claus, who spoke this morning, biggest threat to freedom, democracy, the market economy, and prosperity is now what he calls ambitious environmentalism. When I was at Bali at the UN conference, oceanfront hotel, 5 stars, tropical paradise, the UN knows how to throw a party, but they also know how to advocate for a global tax. This was at a panel discussion. They urged a global carbon dioxide tax emission. They said that wealthy nations like the US would have to go under the polluters pay principle. This is the climate justice campaigner talking about Bali. A climate change response must have at the heart a redistribution of wealth and resources. So you see, there might be something else here besides concern for the environment. Former Colorado Senator Tim Wirth, even if the theory of global warming is wrong, we will be doing the right thing in terms of economic policy and environmental policy. Read that again, because that tells you so much that you need to know there. And other politicians, other people have made the same claim, kind of like, even if we're wrong, we're doing the right thing. And I'm sure they would have said that in the 1970s about global cooling, probably said the same thing about overpopulation. They probably said, 10 years ago, I did an Amazon rainforest, well, 8 years ago, did an Amazon rainforest documentary. It just shows you how much has changed in 8 years. Back then, the Sting, the musician, had an annual rainforest concert in New York. It was a big bash, Hollywood. Global warming was not on the radar. It's amazing how every other environmental issue has just been swept aside. And in fact, committed environmentalists now say global warming is not even among the top 10 environmental problems. And these are committed environmental scientists who have had it with the environmental movement. People like David Noble, people like Dennis Rancourt of Canada, Robert Giegengak, who voted for Gore and now says that his freshman underclass know more about climate science than Al Gore. He literally says the top 10 environmental problems, global warming isn't on it. And they've hijacked the environmental movement. And so there's going to be some blowback there, because a lot of environmentalists, the committed conservationists, see what's happening here. This is becoming a political activism, not an environmental issue. Senator Joseph Lieberman, the co-author of the bill coming up before Congress. It's hard to imagine Lieberman-Warner will not cost, over time, hundreds of billions of dollars. That's the co-author admitting that. And other estimates have put it in the trillions. Washington Post, just last November, current global warming will, quote, require a wholesale transformation of the nation's economy and society. There's Al Gore. He's the one ready to go over that. He's ready to take on that wholesale transformation. I can't understand, and this is Al Gore talking again about young people. I can't understand why there aren't rings of young people blocking bulldozers, preventing them from constructing coal-fired power plants. Gore is advocating, again, people standing up in front of this. Where is our energy policy going to go when you have a former vice president quoted saying this? Cutting emissions, $1.8 trillion. Current proposals, $4,500 climate tax on American families. And they will do nothing to alter the climate. This is what the American people are going to be asked to do, possibly in May, at a time of a recession, at a time where they're talking stimulus packages, at a time of high gas prices. Alan Greenspan, I don't know what his views are on the science of global warming. He's certainly weighed in on the solution. He's called cap and trade or popular only until the real people lose real jobs, and there's no way to meaningfully reduce emissions without negatively impacting large part of the economy. And again, what if we were facing the climate crisis? That's the temperatures with Kyoto and without. You can't even, the blue line is without Kyoto, the black line is with Kyoto. It's barely detectable impact, assuming full compliance, and we all know that's not happening. No detectable impact. So when we come down to it in May, if it comes down to it, our goal is to get talk radio, the internet. We're going to bring out the wake the sleeping giant in America and ask a couple questions. And they should ask this of their senators before they vote. What impact will the climate bill have on the climate? Nothing. What impact will it have on energy? Oh, there'll be higher gas, energy, home heating. And what kind of result will that have? And it's going to hurt the poor, fixed income. And then the next question should be, what's the latest science say? And we all know what the latest science has been saying. 2007 was called the tipping point for climate alarm, as the peer-reviewed studies after peer-reviewed study debunked it. So if you ask these series of questions to a U.S. senator before the vote, the American people will be outraged because the answer does not justify a yes vote for any so-called solution. We like to say all economic pain for no climate gain. This is the Lieberman-Warner bill. Again, this is something interesting. Besides all the regulatory and economic impact, Senator Kit Bond of Missouri called it the Rube Goldberg, would be proud of it, and here's why. There's a thing called the Carbon Market Efficiency Board. This isn't just your usual cap and trade bill. This is, some people have compared it to Hillary's health care plan from 1993. It's going to start a Carbon Market Efficiency Board, presidentially appointed, that's going to try to set a price on carbon, and this is a chart showing all the different interactions between this board, the Climate Change Credit Corporation, the regulatory power of the EPA, energy assistance, energy technology, all the stuff going in, farmers, families, drivers, workers. This is as Kit Bond, Senator Kit Bond says, the Rube Goldberg of climate bills. And the other argument, and again, BBC and Miles O'Brien, who was asking people yesterday if this was the Flat Earth Society meeting, those were his line of questions from CNN was here. People always say, well, what if you're wrong? Shouldn't we have an insurance policy? They should be asked, what if you're right? What solution have you proposed? What credible solution would have an impact in 2.5 decades of fear here? And people always say it's home insurance. It's like you wouldn't buy a house without having insurance. Well, would you buy home insurance that had a huge upfront premium for virtually no payout? And that's what all these climate bills would be. If they were actual insurance policies, they'd be investigated for false advertisement. Former Governor Jerry Brown has said it's not viable for the developing world to develop. They can't develop like us. This is where you get into the morality now. You have, this was at the Earth Summit in Johannesburg, 2002. Jerry Brown believes the developing world can't develop like the Europe and the United States because the Earth would need 5 more planets. So once you get that in your head, then you start saying, wait a minute, 1.6 billion people don't have electricity. People are dying of malaria, bad water. When you don't have running water and electricity, it usually means you don't have medical care. It usually means you have high infant mortality. This was my favorite. Leon Lowe, who's actually here at this conference, South African free market advocate, he said that the third world should tell the first world to go to hell. If they want swamps and jungles, which they romantically call wetlands and rainforests, preserved at the expense of economic growth. I saw this in the Amazon. I interviewed indigenous people. Sting would go down to the Amazon, other celebrities, environmentalists, and they'd try to stop development that people wanted because they wanted progress, civilization, and essentially the wealthy Westerners would fly in, do a couple days of protest, fly home, and leave the people. One of the men told me from Rainforest Relief that people have lived just fine for thousands of years without running water and electricity. He himself had an email, fax number, a card, a phone, so he didn't follow that himself. And this, of course, is the toilet paper issue. Sheryl Crow advocates counting squares of toilet paper. She now says she was joking. But if you look through this all part of this anti-development agenda, which, again, is going to be impacting the United States. And it's a huge economic cost in the U.S. It's going to hurt poor people. 2006 survey said homeless people, homeless families with children, cited energy costs as one of the reasons they were homeless, top 3 reasons. But it's the third world, the developing world. Here you have different celebrities. New York City environmentalists eliminate toilet paper to save the planet. Flush toilets called an environmental disaster. Diaperless babies. They're playing with people's lives in the developing world. This is Time magazine now. The Model T. They gave it the worst car, one of the worst cars of all time, because the consequence of putting every living soul on gas-powered wheels are piling up, from air over our cities to sand under our soldiers' boots. Now, would they rather we have animal waste out here in the streets of New York City, horse manure, or would they rather the automobile and transportation? It's absolutely amazing. But if you think about it, cow emissions, according to UN, are actually more damaging to the planet, if you say CO2 is damaging, than all the transportation sector. So I don't know why Time's going after the Model T. They should be going after a cow. Okay, reality check. Let's wrap this up here. When you look at all the demonization of carbon-based economy, CO2 emissions, this is where you just got to take a pause and say carbon-based economies have been one of the greatest liberators of mankind in the history of our planet. We need to say that. You need to defend, at some point, it doesn't mean we go 100 years, 200 years, continue the same technology. The solution here is you move on to new technologies and you move on to let technology go and you invest in the future and you technology share. But yet at some point, you've got to acknowledge the role carbon-based economies have had. They've allowed unprecedented advances, lowering infant mortality, medical care, sanitation, transportation, food production, technology. The list of advances goes on and on. The poverty-stricken nations of the developing world, they're poised to ride a similar carbon-based miracle in the 21st century unless climate fears and unfounded eco-scares stop it from happening. And that's the very scary thing. If you go around the developing world, you will find that environmentalists are not favorites of indigenous people and tribal people and people that live, you can't use the word primitive, by the way. The left doesn't, the environmental left doesn't like the word primitive. They think it's pejorative and it's got values. They like to say traditional lifestyle, but it's hard not to call someone living in, a mud hut or a hut made of dung primitive. And by the way, Hollywood celebrities like Drew Barrymore and MTV flew around the world and they praised huts made of dung, called it cool, super neat. They praised going #2 out in the woods without modern plumbing. They thought it was the neatest thing as they chartered boats, helicopters, planes, and flew around the world, showing these environmental beacons to the MTV viewers. Our website, epw.senate.gov. I urge you to go check out the 400+ scientists report. I urge you to check out our polar bear report, which will be relevant pretty soon coming up here. And we have our blog, which won an award. It actually won an award that the JFK School of Government at Harvard University was part of making. Senator James Inhofe got an award, so linked to the Harvard School of Government. So we're very proud of that. Won the Gold Mouse Award. epw.senate.gov. Thank you.